Okay, so we are going to continue on and start where we have left off last time. So this week, we're going to talk more specifically about social constructivist perspectives. And with that, we have to start by talking about this person's name, Carl Rogers. So what essentially is highlighted, has anyone read about this idea of social constructivists before coming to class? There's actually a keyword here related to this idea of social constructivism and humanistic psychologies. Can anyone guess what this two word is? To give you a hint, the second word is person, something person. Did I write it down here? It's 5-letter word. Great, whole person. Okay, so the main idea that undergirds or that drives this idea of social constructivists, especially coming from Carl Rogers, is this idea of whole person. What do you think this whole person refers to or means? Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard an expression called part person, but what do you think this idea of whole person refers to? Do you think we're talking about whole person as a teacher, like looking at the teacher and saying, looking at teacher, viewing teachers as whole person, or do you think it's more about the learners as whole person? Learners, we're very good. So here in when we're talking about the focus of this idea that Carl Rogers presents is this idea that we are moving a little bit away from teaching and leaning a little bit toward learning. So we are focusing more on learners in the sense, looking at how the focus is more about the process of learning rather than teaching. If you guys remember, when we are talking about behavioral perspectives, for example, we were more focused on the stimulus, like what is provided to the students, right? How we should teach them. But in this particular case, it's more about how they learn. So the more focus here is on the sense that we are looking at the context. So when we talk about the humanistic psychology, it finally emphasizes the development of an individual self-concept and also personal sense of reality, as well as the internal forces that motivate a person to act. So as you can tell, that it focuses more on the person's emotion, motivation, and willingness. So in this case, teachers should become facilitators of learning. So as you can see that they are facilitating, promoting the learning process, not really guiding the whole thing. So it's not really focusing on the teaching, but more on the facilitating by establishing meaningful interpersonal relationships with others. So as you can say that Rogers is not really concerned about, he is concerned about the actual process of learning, but it's much more focused on the context. So if the context provides enough input, then human beings could naturally do the learning. So that's the way this idea of humanistic psychology was developed. So effective facilitators of learning, here we are referring to the teachers, right? So these effective facilitators of learning should be real and genuine, discarding masks of superiority or omniscience. So we are no longer viewing teachers as the holders of knowledge. They are not the authoritative figure in the classroom anymore, but they are just real, genuine people that these learners get to interact with. So the view of the teachers, the roles and responsibilities of teachers and learners are a little bit different from what we have been told about previously. They also have to have genuine trust, acceptance, and respect for students as worthy and valuable individuals. So when the teachers are interacting with the learners, they have to view the learners as a valuable, worthy individuals rather than just an empty slate, just accepting the knowledge. Okay, so it's like viewing how we understand and position the other person. They should also communicate openly and empathetically with their students and encourage students to do the same. So as you can say that in these descriptions, communication is highlighted, right? Communication in a respectful manner. That's also highlighted. This does not necessarily mean that children or learners can do whatever they want to do. It means that they both need to have this mutual trust, mutual respect to one another. So some of the possible limitations that have been pointed out includes that educators may be tempted to take the non-directive approach too far to the point that valuable time is lost while students attempt to discover facts and principles entirely on their own. In addition, a non-threatening learning environment may become so relaxed that the facilitator tension necessary for learning is absent. I think nowadays we find these cases a lot in I don't watch it that often, but I forgot what the title was. Something 금쪽이. Have you watched it? What's the title?
금쪽이는
What?
금쪽이는 내 집.
금쪽이는 내 새끼. Okay. Thank you. So in this show, it usually has very young children, but a lot of the times it feels like the parents leave them with too much freedom that they lose the time for actual learning of the rules or the norms. So that could be what is described here as possible limitation, that it views the interference or intervention of the teachers to be somewhat ineffective to the point that we lose the appropriate timing. So it means it could be interpreted differently, that some instructors might decide to not intervene at all and just let students be, and then just lose the actual time that where the learning could actually take place. So that is described as possible limitations, and not only for those little children, but for language learning as well. So timing is very, very important. And I think we've been talking about that for a while, right? About finding the appropriate timing to encourage. Sometimes, so this points to this idea, I think, somewhat related to the personal characteristics that we talked about, that some students, let me ask, how many of you would like to receive feedback? Let's say that you're participating in a speaking course, okay? How many of you want to receive feedback as soon as you make the mistake? Some people, okay. How many of you don't want them to intervene at all and then summarize it at the end of what, okay, some of you do that. So what I'm telling you here is some people have different uptake or different styles in receiving feedback even. Some of you might instantly want to be pointed out because I might forget how I used it, right? Especially younger children. If you say that, okay, I'm going to talk to you when I get home, they will eventually forget what they did wrong. So for people with different memory storage, we have different approach too. And some people even prefer to be pointed out at the beginning, as soon as they make the mistake. However, we have to decide on the quantity of feedback too, right? Some of you said that, oh, I would prefer to have like my mistakes pointed out at the end of the session. But sometimes the quantity could also depend on how much you can take. If you are pointed out with every single mistake that you did, then you might feel very overwhelmed and even frustrated with yourself and decide not to continue with this particular person, right? So we have to also decide on the quantity of the feedback, and all this might depend on the individual learner. So this idea, social constructivists, were trying to somewhat step away from the idea that this is the ideal method to a way to look at the students now. Let's look at the students. But as you can tell, very beginning stage of the social constructivism also has some flaws with it, and we'll talk about them now. So another very famous figure that I personally like too is called Vygotsky. If you guys remember, during the first 2 weeks, I showed you a table called ZPD, talking about the zone of proximal development, and that was proposed by Vygotsky. Vygotsky is a very famous figure when it comes to children's learning, and he was not the one who specifically talked about language learning. However, the ideas that he had, concepts actually referred to, or a lot of teachers and learners in fact, were drawn to this idea of Vygotsky social, cultural, and affective factors that we are going to talk about. I think I mentioned the name Bakhtin before. He was also this guy here. Vygotsky is also a Russian philosopher. And a lot of the Russian philosophers had these different ideas. I think it comes from the era as well, when they were trying to go against this idea of monolingual or authoritative voices. They were trying to say that they, in fact, came, I mean, not him, but Bakhtin came up with this idea of having the dialogue. Dialogue was important. Here, what we mean by dialogue is not just the conversation between two people, but it was against this idea of having one voice in the society, monologue, versus dialogue, multiple voices. And you can understand that this is when it came out, this idea. So according to Vygotsky, we have these different factors that are highlighted here. These concepts are not the only ones, but these are some of the very important concepts that he talked about. So first one has to do with social, cultural, and affective factors, where learning is shaped by social interaction and cultural context. And cognitive development occurs through interaction with others. From these two sentences, which word do you think was highlighted? Which one would you underline? It's usually the words that are repeated twice. Interaction, great. Social interaction is the most important concept here. We were talking about people interacting with the other people, and from that, learning occurs. I think it makes sense. When you meet people outside of your comfort zone, you get to experience that, oh, this person is very different from me, or this person has a very different background. I wonder why this person acts this way. But only through the interaction, you'll be able to realize where they come from and also where you come from. So when you start to understand that not everyone is like you get those experiences from the interactions only. So here, when we talk about social interaction, it's not only the human to human, but you can also experience this with your laptop, like your blog, for example, when you read a novel, read like some people's anecdotes, or read other people's reflections. Like when you guys submitted the language reflections, for example, I was reading them, I get to experience where you come from, right? It's only through those interactions that I get to really understand who you are. So that's what is highlighted here, the social interaction. Mediation is another very important concept that is discussed in the Vygotsky's term. And one is that learning is mediated through symbols, signs, and language. Language serves as primary tool for thinking and meaning making. What do you guys think this means? Or can anyone think about an example? I mean, you can just stay with this. I feel like, oh, I don't know what happened during that time, but these sentences by Russian philosophers, you can just get stuck to it, one sentence, and just think about it for, I think, like, not the whole day, but half a day, I guess. What do you guys think this mean about mediated, how learning is mediated through symbols, signs, and language?
Mediation implies interaction, right? So if it's mediated through language, means that it happens in a social space kind of platform.
Oh, so I think Anel just made a very good connection between the two concepts that came before and after. That in order for social interaction to actually occur, you need the mediation, right, between you and the other person. With you and the textbook, you need the words. You need to be able to understand the language on the text. You need to be able to read the font, right? All those signals and also images, figures. All those are through mediation. That's very simple, right? So I think I'm sorry that I put you guys into a very uncomfortable situation where it seemed like a difficult question, but it's actually very simple. Do you want to ask something?
Yeah, so is it saying that we cannot really learn something without those symbols, signs, or language? I mean, when we are thrown into the forest, we can learn something just seeing the trees.
That's mediation.
Yeah.
Yes. So let's say that you start to warm yourself with a wood, or you get into a tree and or you get a branch from a tree and then you start, I don't know, is it possible to make fire? I don't know. It might take a lot of time, and you need to lose the humidity, I guess. I'm not really familiar in that area, but even those would be the tools, right? So that would be an example of a good mediation. So it's to use those tools to mediate. So learning. So all these types of learning would come from mediation. So very good. And I think Anil just pointed out how they are all somewhat connected, but the underscoring idea is again social interaction. And another one that points to interaction is when you are talking about the role of others. In Vygotsky, there's a term called MKO. This means knowledge. This is others. What do you think M stands for? So it suggests that this is needed in learning. MKO.
More.
Did I? Okay. So I already wrote down the answers there. Very good. MKO stands for more knowledgeable others. Here, when we talk about, so the others is very important, as you can imagine, in social interaction. You need the other person. Here we have another person, Douglas Brown, other, right, from our textbook. So it's not just human to human that you can actually touch or shake hands with, but actually just anyone, the other entity that exists in the learning process. So in this case, it suggests that knowledge is co-constructed through interaction with more knowledgeable others. Here, more knowledgeable others, I think I somewhat mentioned it at the very beginning, but it is not limited to people who are more advanced or who know more than you. What this means is it's not something that we can say that since this person belongs to an advanced class and this A belongs to an advanced class, B belongs to a beginner class. So in this case, the more knowledgeable other would always be A. That's not true, according to Vygotsky. It could shift depending on the context, depending on what they're talking about. They can all get something out of each other. So here, the more knowledgeable others, more knowledgeable others. Usually people think that this more knowledgeable others are usually teachers or caretakers like parents. However, they also start to look at peers. So anyone around you, you can learn from them. So that's the idea related to the role of others. That is the reason why we don't specifically say that you get it, the knowledge is post-constructed through interaction with teachers and peers. We don't say that, right? Because this could include so many different people depending on the dynamics. So the key idea that we can take away from Vygotsky is that learning is fundamentally a social and collaborative process where meaning is co-constructed, and constructed through interaction. So even in this one slide, we see a lot of words like interaction, social, right, and co-construction. So those are the key ideas that you can think of when we are referring to Vygotsky. Can you guys think about any activities that you did or you were doing in class that might reflect Vygotsky's concepts?
Very common goals discussions.
Very good. The small group discussions, when you're talking with a pair, exchanging ideas, that is also a part of the social interaction, right? So that is, I mean, when I send you guys into small breakout rooms or any other professors who ask you guys to work in groups, right? Group projects. They don't ask you to do that because they feel like group projects would put you into misery. It's not that. They actually feel like there are benefits from learning one another, negotiating, discussing. Sometimes there are tensions, but tensions are not bad. It is actually somewhat, it promotes the somewhat of a negotiating process. So those are understood to be good. So those are some of the examples related to the social, cultural, and affective factors. So moving on to the next slide, when we are going over some of the types of learning. First of all, there are different types that I don't necessarily want you to memorize all those. You can just go through them. Okay, so these seems to be some types. One of them is called like signal learning, where we are just referring to the Pavlov signal, right? There are other types of learning, including stimulus response, where a precise response to a discriminated stimulus, including the Skinner's approach, where learning the sound system in a language could be like so repeating the sound, for example, that could be one. Chaining is other ones. You can just go through them. For this one, you can just use it as a reference, but I'm not going to put this into midterm, or I'm not going to ask you to memorize this, but it would be nice to just go through them and see how the things that we have talked about were somewhat reflected in the types of learning. More important ones. So now we have different concepts in learning called transfer and generalization in learning. So here, transfer refers to the carryover of previous performance or knowledge to subsequent learning. So what you are bringing from your own learning experience and transferring it to the upcoming, the current learning event. Interference and overgeneralization might be something that you might already be familiar with, but interference refers to a form of negative transfer in which previous learning disrupts the performance of a second task. So, which points to the difficulty of learning because you have already had an understanding of L1 experience, right? That is stuck in your mind that might come in intervening the process, intervening the second language learning. Overgeneralization, as you can tell, could just refer to the excessive generalization that occurs when a second language learner applies a rule or item beyond its legitimate bounds, regardless of the native language. So they are basically overgeneralizing the rules that they learn in the second language. So as you can tell, transfer is somewhat neutral, but interference and overgeneralization are somewhat of a negative counterparts that we talk about, that it might interfere in the process of language learning. Generalization is a little bit different. Do you guys think that generalization is good or not really positive?
Not really positive.
Not really positive? Well, okay, first of all, we need to think about the difference between generalization and overgeneralization. So we just mentioned that overgeneralization might work against the learning, right? Might somewhat hinder or slower the process. How about the difference between generalization and overgeneralization? I think I should have asked that question first. So generalization is the process of, it says, of inferring or deriving a rule, law, or conclusion from the observation of a particular instance. Which one do you think we often, which one do you think sounds a little bit more neutral or even natural?
Generalization.
Generalization, right? Overgeneralization is applying it to every single case, right? Overuse it. But generalization, when you think about it, it is something that we naturally do in a way, right? Otherwise, it would be very difficult, don't you think? So let's say that you go into an English classroom and you learn about the past tense, and say your teacher says that you put an ed, or let's say ed or d at the end, and so you first learn that you apply this using the generalization, right? So you say that okay, so I'm going to start with the word work, then I worked, right? So people just learn those. Then after getting yourself exposed to this, then you might start applying those to other ones. So it's called generalization. However, once you're applying this to every single item without being considerate of irregular verbs or other cases, even though you are exposed to that, then it's called overgeneralization. So the line is a little bit thin. So it might be very difficult to say that one moves from generalization to overgeneralization. I think it depends more on the attitudes and being a bit aware of the fact that there could be these different possibilities. In addition to that, when we talk about overgeneralization or generalization, I think generalization, in fact, somewhat promotes the learning, right, on your own, right? Because once you learn that without the teacher pointing out every single verb and every single expression and pointing what the past tense of that is, you get to use the generalization skill in order to utilize that one. So it's somewhat expected. What I actually do to my students in my English classes is that because we are grown up, we know how to analyze what's given to us, and we have those analytic skills. You'd be very surprised. I long time ago, I forgot when, like 10 years ago, I went to Russia for the first time, and I went to St. Petersburg. And how many has anyone been there before? I don't think we'd be able to go there now, but when I went there, I everything was in Russian. I was very surprised, like not even a single English word. So I was like, oh my God, what am I gonna do? And what I found, however, interesting was I saw McDonald's. How do you think I found that it was McDonald's? Yeah, the M sign, the happy M sign, and also colors. It was red and yellow. So I was like, oh, that's McDonald's. But underneath it, it was all in Russian. So, but interestingly, what I was doing was, I don't know any Russian, but I could actually make connection. Okay, so that seems to be the M sound, and that seems to be the A sound. So you can actually figure it out. What this means as adult learners, we have already this tool, right, to interpret the sound system. So even if you don't, like the example of Saudi, for instance, even though you have no idea what that language looks like or understand the shape of it, you'll be able to somewhat analyze it because we have this skill to generalize what the usual rules are. So if the words were, the Russian was used for like desk, I won't be able to tell, but it was since we were both referring to a foreign language, the sound system. So I was able to generalize the rules or generalize this, at least the sound alphabets. So it's somewhat natural, I would have to say. Yeah.
So are there any some kind of borderline between generalization and overgeneralization?
So as I just mentioned, the borderline is very thin. So we won't be able to say that, oh, that person just went one overgeneralized or like 50 over 50. It's really difficult to do that. It just has to do with the degree and how much it impacts the learning. Generalization is not looked at something that is negative, but overgeneralization is. So that's the difference between the two. So moving on now, we have to talk about inductive and deductive reasoning. Can anyone tell me the difference between the two?
It is kind of reverse. Opposite.
It's at the end of the spectrum, right? When we do let's say that you come up with a specific instance and you let's say you interact with the specific instances and you go through the generalization. What do you think that process is? Inductive or deductive? Inductive. So usually L1 learning, your native language learning, would include inductive or deductive. What do you think? Inductive, right? A lot of children learn their first language in an inductive, using the inductive manner. Deductive is a little bit different. It's the other way around, right? You get to be exposed to the knowledge, the grammatical rules first, and then you go to the specific instances. So the arrows are a little bit different. So going back to the slide, the inductive reasoning refers to the process of observing a number of specific instances and deriving a general rule, law, or conclusion that governs those instances. Deductive reasoning refers to the process of moving from a general principle to specific instances. Particular facts are inferred or deduced from a general rule. So you learn about the general rule first. So some of the examples that I have listed here for example, the inductive learning would usually happen in playgrounds, like children playing with each other, and then from those experiences, they come up with a rule, right? So you're not supposed to do this, you're not supposed to do that. So they come up with the rules afterwards. So discovering the language patterns, usually through exposure and examples first. That's inductive learning. Deductive learning refers to learning rules first and then applying them to the examples. So similar to the this idea where you're learning about the past tense first and then applying it, that's usually the deductive learning that occurs. Which one do you think is more effective? And this is a very difficult question. Which one do you think is more effective in classrooms?
Adaptive.
Deductive? Why?
Because the resource is limited. We have limited time.
The time limit, that's actually one thing. So usually in a classroom, when you go into a course, they usually follow a course schedule, right? So they have only a limited time, and usually you stay for what, like 1 hour maximum, right? Unless it's an immersion camp situation. So during that 1 hour, you have to make most out of it. So therefore, usually the teachers go for deductive learning. What might be the challenges, or not only challenges, the limitations of deductive learning?
General rule will have to be given.
Yes. So, oh yeah, definitely. So you have to be pointing out the rules first and then applying the rules, right? In this case, what might happen, let's say, for example, the learners, do you think they would enjoy, or do you think when you go into a classroom and it feels like the traditional classroom, right? So one thing that people are afraid of is, I think, yeah, I can't get out of the room. You might want to use the red one. Well, what am I talking about? So as you can tell, the memory loss, right? Happening right now. Oh, yes. So usually people say that inductive learning stays a little bit longer. I think it goes back to what we talked about last time, because you learned it from the specific instances it's like your own exploration, your own investigation. Therefore, it might stay longer. However, it is definitely time consuming. The other way around, deductive learning or deductive reasoning, from that, it might be very time efficient, right? However, it might often be presented as boring. And it might not really stay with you that long because you're just applying the rules, right? Unless you repeat, it might not be that motivated to the students. However, I would have to say that it again depends on the learners. Some learners do really want to find out about the rules by themselves, right? So they get to be thrown into text, exploring the text, finding out the rules for themselves. Some learners just want to get the rules first and then apply them. So it also depends on the individual learners in different ways. So once you start to figure out, I think like nowadays we have AIs these days, but we could in fact mix them up, the inductive and deductive learning process, or depending on the learner's preference, we can in fact put much ratio in the other one and provide them with different activities. So I think that could actually be something that could be developed later on. So moving on to the next part, we are going to now talk about something called language aptitude. Today's class, I have a lot of concept descriptions, definitions of that. So it might seem a little bit boring because this is deductive learning. But the language aptitude here refers to an individual's ability to learn a foreign or second language efficiently. So people have started to understand why some people seems to be very good at language learning, but some people do not. And they started to wonder what might be the differences between them. So what they found out so far has to do with some of the learner characteristics. That had to do with, first of all, risk-taking. Do you guys know what risk-taking is? Like bungee jumping, right? Risk-taking. DUI is not really a good risk-taking behavior. I hope you guys are not doing DUI, driving under influence. Good that you guys don't know that. Good. So when we talk about risk-taking, what could be some of the risk-taking behaviors in the classroom?
Answering a question.
Yeah. Right? Answering questions to other people, that's actually very scary because you might be wrong, right? It's a risk-taking behavior. Because it could end up somewhat humiliating yourself, right? And also, you might end up getting the answers wrong. That's also a type of risk-taking. How about memory efficiency? So some students are very good at memorizing certain items, right? Memorizing the rules, memorizing vocabularies, and memorizing different parts. So it also depends on the memorization skills of the students. Some people are good at memorizing numerical numbers. Some students are good at playing with the language. It's actually very different depending on the learners. The intelligent guessing is another one that was able to that was pointed out about how the students could guess. So when we are guessing, it's actually using your intelligence too. You're not just guessing randomly, right? You're guessing based on your previous knowledge. So that intelligent guessing has to do with that. Moving on to the fourth item, tolerance. This is an interesting point. Tolerance of ambiguity. How do you think you yourself are in terms of tolerance, your tolerance level? None. You have no tolerance. So when we talk about the tolerance of ambiguity, some students are okay to leave it as is and think, okay, so I think I'm going to learn about it next week, right? Or I will probably ask my instructor after the class. Some students has to know about it right now, right? So it's very different. It's just learner characteristics. Some people want to get those ambiguity out, right? Because they can't really handle it. It might bother him too much or her. But some people can just stay with the tolerance, not knowing. I think this has to do with like if a friend of you says like, oh, I have a secret. I have a secret that I want to tell you, and then just goes to class. Some of you might feel like, oh yeah, that person's gonna tell me what it's all about and just leave it as is. Some people, you might be wondering, what is it? You'll be texting during class. It's again going back to tolerance of ambiguity. Language aptitude tests. So after going through these learner characteristics, people were trying to find out about these learners and wanted to, of course, come up with tests to find out who they were, right? A lot of these tests were trying to find out about these types of learner characteristics, what were their tolerance level, and how that might impact their learning. So these, for example, modern language aptitude test or the battery, these are some of the different types of tests that came out. So these tests measure the ability to perform focused, analytical, and context-reduced activities that are typical of tasks in a traditional language classrooms. So trying to find out about the learner characteristics once more. And we are going to later talk about it too, but MBTI is also relevant later on. That people were trying to, that's going to come in chapter, I forgot where, like probably in the later chapters, but people were also trying to find out about the personal characteristics much more than just learner. Here, this one, it has more to do with the traditional language classroom characteristics, right? However, the MBTI is a little bit broader, in fact. Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence is another idea that came out, where the human intelligence is not just a single ability, but consists of multiple types of intelligences. So here, linguistic intelligence is one, where we're talking about linguistic. Moving on to the logical mathematical, and we also need to have musical sense, the intonation and all, the spatial idea, bodily kinesthetic intelligence, naturalist intelligence, interpersonal, all these different types of intelligences. I think the chapter also provides us with examples of each intelligences. So I'm not going to go into them in detail, but there are these efforts in trying to understand how people are constituted of multiple intelligences, even in the language learning. So reviewing, oh, I thought, oh, we were in fact going to do this, right? And I forgot. Memory loss, blaming my memory. So this might be the chart that you have seen at the very beginning, where I have filled out the answers for you guys just to clarify what are some of the key notions and review them by looking at the differences between behavioral, cognitive, and social constructivist. One thing that you'll be able to find out was even in these two, it was more looking at the students as just receiving the conditions, or they are the ones who are developing this cognitive connection. But the social constructivist moves on to focus more on learner. So you see the keyword like learner, social interaction, and all these that we talked about. I would have to say that the current methods that people use, people might often think that a lot of them has to do with social constructivists because it came last, right? So you might say that obviously now we are in the social constructivist era and we are using this particular perspective. However, that is not in fact true. If you in fact go to like a classroom and do some sort of an observation, you might find a lot of behavioral and cognitive approaches that are still there. We are just meshing them together somewhat and using them depending on situations. So you might in fact see like a collage of these perspectives all playing a role at the same time. But sometimes one might be highlighted much more compared to others. So we have more on our plate now. So learning theories in the classroom, in the language classroom more specifically, we are going to take a look at two different methods. One has to do with ALM, audio-lingual method, and the other one has to do with community language learning. So the first one, audio-lingual method, it provides us with the steps on coming up with the audio and using the audio-lingual method is, first of all, new materials presented in a dialogue form. It's audio, right? So you are listening to a tape or you're listening to a conversation. We use the audio. There is dependency on mimicry, and you're mimicking the other person, memorization of set phrases. Let's say, for example, how are you? Repeat. How are you? Repeat. How are you? There's a mimicry, right? We mimic. And also, there are set of phrases. It's not just one word, but set phrases. And also overlearning. So when I say repeat, repeat, I think it's usually repeating like 4 or 5 times, right? So that's what happens in audio-lingual method. Structures are sequenced through contrastive analysis and taught one at a time. This sounds very different, but we have a sequence from how are you to move on to next step. How are you? I think in classroom we learn I'm fine, thank you, and you, right? So those are the sequences that move on from one to another, but they are taught one at a time. It's not just going to be a bundle of different sentences, one at a time. Because we are only using our raw audio linguistic skills, right? We are not using the text, we are just hearing. So therefore, the way that our memory can hold, it's very short. Here, structural patterns are taught using repetitive drills, repeating, and there's little or no grammatical explanation. So I'm not going, in the classroom, the teacher does not explain the grammatical rules. Grammar is taught, therefore, through inductive analogy rather than deductive explanation that we just looked at, right? You're just hearing it, saying it, using the specific instances. If you use how are you, and the next time you learn about what's up, then you can make some sort of a connection between the two, but it's inductive. Vocabulary is strictly limited and learned in context. So this is another thing related to audio-lingual method. You are hearing it, so therefore you can't hear a bunch of words at the same time. So therefore it is limited. And also we are using what is available in context. There is extensive use of tapes, language laboratories, and visual aids. Try to think about how children learn when you use the visual images if you can't bring car in the classroom, right? So you show an image of a car and you can say, where's your car? And the students use, where's your car? So that's the type of thing. I don't think we use tapes anymore. Do you guys know tapes even? Or probably nowadays, I think even DVDs are gone, right? Anyway, so we used to have tapes. The teacher used to bring like a cassette tape player and then put the cassette in and plays it. Wow. Okay. And then we played with like you rewind it and then play it again, rewind it. Yeah. you don't have that memory, do you, or experience? We used to play with it to an extent that you probably don't know this singer, but we used to have a group called 서태지와 아이들, 서태지 and 아이들. I don't think children is an appropriate expression, but we used to play with the cassette tape of their song and said like if you rewind it and play, I don't know how it worked, but you can hear ghosts like crying and stuff. Anyways, that was a very short story of the tapes here. I got stuck to that. Anyways, going back. Great importance is attached to pronunciation, of course, because you are only focusing on listening and speaking. Only the pronunciation is very important. Enunciation of the teacher is also important. The teacher had to deliver it in a very clear manner because they are not using any other method. I mean, other text, for example. They were only using the mode, the speaking. Very little use of mother tongue by the teacher is permitted. And so the mother tongue is somewhat permitted, but very, very little. Successful responses are immediately reinforced. In this case, the reason why the responses were immediately respond. Do you guys can you guys guess why it was immediately reinforced? Let's say I said like more knowledgeable. No, staccato, 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 staccato. Everyone says one word, right? Why do you think the responses are immediately reinforced, whether it was good or not?
To encourage.
To encourage, yes.
Not forget.
To not forget, right? So, for example, when I ask, we can actually do it, staccato, staccato, then in that case, if you pronounce it correctly, I would say good, good, good. If you did not pronounce it correctly, what would happen? The teacher would actually repeat the word or ask you to say it one more time, right? So it's not reinforced in that case. So only the successful ones get reinforced for the memory so that you remember, oh, okay, so this is the way I say it. And if it's not, then the teacher says, like, continue on the trying of the new sound. So these two connected are somewhat the close connection to the audiolingual method, where in the classroom you are mostly using your target language. So you're only using, for example, if it's an English class, only using English, but sometimes the teacher can use very limited Korean if they're Korean teachers and students. There's a strong effort to get students to produce error-free utterances, right? So you are basically training them to basically speak, not to write or anything. There's a tendency to manipulate language and disregard content. What this means is that content itself is not really that meaningful. It's more about the drilling of the sound. So the audiolingual method was particularly introduced to foster people's pronunciation, speaking skills in chunks. So as you can tell, this was one interesting method that people have tried before. Community language learning is a little bit different. In this case, we have this idea of counseling that comes in community language learning. Community language learning does not mean that you get to get yourself immersed in the community and target community and just start learning the L2 with the speakers of those languages. It's not that. Here, what it's emphasized in community is this idea of support, emotional support, and counseling. So counseling learning model of education was extended to language learning contexts in the form of community language learning. The CLL learning process emphasizes the supported relationship between the teachers and learners. In your textbook, you'll be able to find the specific steps involved in the CLL learning process. I want you to take a short minute and talk with your partners about what these steps would involve, like the audiolingual method, and go through the step-by-step process, and we'll talk about them together. It's also in your textbook. I forgot which page, but if you haven't done your reading yet, you can also refer to that. So turn around and with your neighbors, try to talk about the steps. Okay, so why don't we talk about it together? about community language learning, it might be very difficult to visualize it, right? So what it looks like, let me just tell you. Usually in community language learning, people, do you think, because it's community, do you think students sit like the way that you do? Yeah. So they make a circle. So students usually sit around. Here, one of the main key role of the teacher would be 11 word. It's too long to make a guess. Well, the teacher, the skill is dependent on translation. And we're going to talk about why. So what's going to happen is, as I said before, support, emotional comfort, relax. That's all the key terms related to community language learning. What happens is, this is very odd. I don't think a lot of people do it nowadays, but let's say there's a student A who wants to say something. So the student A says it in their mother tongue. So let's say the mother tongue in this classroom is English. And the language that they're trying to learn is Korean. So A says, let's say, no, I am hungry. Then the teacher goes behind the student and translates it to the student. Says, 배가 고파요, right? Then the student repeats, says, 배가 고파요 to other students. Then another student wants to respond. And that student says, I'm not hungry. Then the teacher goes and says again, translates it for that student. So, and then the student would repeat it. Have you experienced something like this in your classroom? So this requires the teachers, well, as you can tell, the teacher's translation skills very, very important, first of all. And the student, of course, will feel very relaxed because they don't necessarily need to know the full sentence or create the sentence in their head. They would just say it in their first language, and then the teacher asks them to repeat it. So that's what community language learning is. So as you can imagine, what might be some of the difficulties in carrying this kind of class out?
It must be inefficient.
It might be inefficient. It takes a lot of time. The teacher is like running around the class, right? Trying to translate.
But why the teachers have to run?
I mean, they can walk. They can walk.
They whisper to the students.
Oh yeah, yes.
Uh-huh.
So they usually tell the students to repeat it. I mean, it depends on the teacher. Sometimes the teacher might whisper. Sometimes the teacher might in fact say it out loud because other students could in fact hear it. So it could depend on the decision of the teacher. But as you can tell, the L1 use is very much highlighted compared to audiolingual method. Audiolingual method, you might only, a lot of the times hear only the target language. In this class, it's pretty much half-half. But the student usually produces the L1 first. So as you can tell, it might be somewhat difficult for the teacher, right? Because they have to know the exact way of describing what the student wants to talk about. So I'm going to show you guys a very short clip and let's take a look at it.
Good morning, class. Fine, thanks. How are you?
Fine, thanks.
Good. I'm happy to hear that.
Did you hear that? Once, because they were repeating it over and over again, he said, I'm fine, how are you? And the other person said, the student said, hi, I'm fine, how are you? Like they went with the, I'm fine, how are you too?
Good morning, class.
ALM.
Good. I'm happy to hear that. Today's lesson is going to be about thanks. How are you?
Fine, thanks.
Good. I'm happy to hear that. Today's lesson is going to be about two people, about a salesman, a special kind of a salesman. Now, you know what a salesman is. That's a person who sells something to somebody else, a salesman. We're going to, today the salesman is a vacuum cleaner salesman, and the other person, here's the vacuum cleaner salesman, and let me write that. The other person is a woman, or we could call her a housewife. So now, I want you to just listen and watch what I do. Listen carefully, watch what I do, and try to understand. Okay? I'm the salesman now, okay? I'm going to be both people. I'm going to play two roles. I'm going to be the salesman and the woman. Okay. Ring, ring, ring. Ring, 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 ring. Now, the woman. Hello? Hello, madam. Would you like to have the cleanest house in town? Yes, of course I would. Then, madam, you need the amazing Hoover vacuum cleaner. No, I don't. Salesman. What? Why not? Because my husband does the cleaning in our house. Oh. Okay, now listen, and I'll do it one more time. You just listen and don't talk this time. Listen again, I'll do it one more time. So, rings the bell. Good morning. Morning, madam. Would you like to have the cleanest house in town? Yes, of course I would. Then, madam, you need the amazing Hoover vacuum cleaner. The woman says, no, I don't. Salesman says, what? Why not? And the woman says, because my husband does the cleaning in our house. And the salesman says, oh, all right. Now, we're going to learn this together now. I'm going to help you learn how to say this whole dialogue, okay?
So then he moves on to describe how each of the turn develops with the students, repeat drilling. So this is an example of an audio lingual method that we talked about, presenting with the dialogue first, and then going through the turns, each turn with the student. You can tell that it's a very old video, right? And I feel bad for the guy because it seems like he has a very enthusiastic audience there. But so as you can tell, the audio lingual method presents the teachers to do a lot of acting, and they're coming up with the vacuum cleaner, the box, for example, using realia and using the acting and also the speech itself. So as you can tell that a lot of the time the students are only hearing, and then afterwards from practicing they would repeat and speak. So okay, I think that's it for this week's class. And what else was I saying? Next, oh no, hold on. Next, yes, this is the end, right? Okay, I'm sorry. I thought we had the weekly reflection. This is the end of the class, and next week we're going to move on to chapter 6 about chapter 6. I'm sorry, chapter 4, right? Or chapter 5, individual differences. So if you have the time, please read the chapter before watching the video, and I will see you guys next week.